The wind in the Wyoming territory didn't just blow. It screamed like 1,000 restless souls trapped in the jagged teeth of the mountain peaks. Jebediah Stone felt that wind in his marrow as he adjusted the brim of his hat, the leather worn thin by years of sun and regret. He was a man made of sharp angles and silent shadows, a predator of the high plains who had long ago forgotten the sound of his own laughter. In his right hand, he held a crumpled piece of paper, a bounty notice that had been soaked by rain and dried by the harsh frontier sun until it felt like ancient parchment. The face on the paper was hauntingly beautiful, framed by dark, wild hair and eyes that seemed to look right through the man holding the ink. Clementine Louvet, wanted for the murder of a senator and the theft of $10,000 in federal gold. Dead or alive, Jeb didn't care which one it was. Money didn't have a conscience, and neither did he. He had tracked her through the Black Hills, through the suffocating heat of the Salt Flats, and finally, up into the frozen silence of the Medicine Bow Mountains. He found her trail not by the tracks she left behind, for she moved like a ghost, but by the rhythm of the land itself. He knew where a person would go when they were tired of running. He knew where a soul went to hide when it was heavy with blood. The cabin was a lonely, rotting structure clinging to the side of a cliff like a tick on a stray dog. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a gray finger pointing toward a leaden sky. Jeb mounted his charcoal stallion, a massive beast that breathed steam into the freezing air, and pulled his Henry repeater from its scabbard. The click of the lever action was only sound in the world, a mechanical heartbeat that signaled the end of a journey. He approached the door with the predatory grace of a mountain lion, his boots making no sound on the frozen earth. He didn't knock. In the West, a knock was a courtesy reserved for friends, and Jeb Stone had no friends. He kicked the door open, the wood splintering against the stone wall, and leveled his rifle at the center of the room. He expected a fight. He expected a desperate woman to lunge at him with a skinning knife or fire a hidden derringer from her sleeve. Instead, he found stillness. Clementine Louvet was sitting by a small, flickering hearth, her hands wrapped around a tin mug. She didn't flinch. She didn't reach for the revolver sitting on the table beside her. She simply turned her head, the firelight dancing in those dark, bottomless eyes, and looked at him with a weariness that matched his own. "You took your time, Jebediah," she said, her voice a low, melodic rasp that vibrated in the small space. "I thought the cold would have claimed you 3 ridges back." Jeb didn't lower the rifle. His finger remained steady on the trigger, the cold steel a familiar comfort against his skin. "How do you know my name?" he demanded, his voice like grinding stones. She smiled then, a small, sad movement of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. "Every hunter leaves a scent, Jeb. Yours smells like old gunpowder and cheap whiskey. I knew you were coming since the moment you crossed the Cheyenne River. A man like you doesn't hide as well as he thinks he does." She stood up slowly, her movements fluid and deliberate, showing him she was unarmed. The firelight caught the edges of her silhouette, highlighting the tattered lace at her throat and the rugged leather of her vest. She was a contradiction, a lady of the East swallowed by the violence of the West. Jeb felt a strange, unwelcome tug in his chest, a ghost of a feeling he thought he had buried in the trenches of the Civil War. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time in his career, the bounty felt like a weight rather than a prize. "The law says you're a killer, Clementine," Jeb said, though the words felt hollow in the quiet of the cabin. "They say you took the life of a man who was trying to bring peace to this territory. I'm here to take you back to Cheyenne, or leave you here for the wolves. The price is the same either way." Clementine took a step toward him, ignoring the barrel of the Henry pointed at her heart. She stopped just inches from the steel, the heat from her body clashing with the cold air pouring in through the open door. "The law is a lie told by men in silk suits to keep men like you in boots and saddles," she whispered. "The senator wasn't killed for justice, Jeb. He was killed because he found out that the gold isn't in a vault. It's buried in the one place no one would ever look. And if you pull that trigger, you'll be killing the only person who knows that your father didn't die in an accident. He was murdered by the same men who put this bounty on my head." The wind slammed the door shut behind him, plunging the room into a deep, amber-hued intimacy. Jeb felt the world narrowing down to this woman and the strange gravity she exerted. He had spent his life chasing shadows, believing that the world was divided into the hunters and the prey. But Clementine didn't fit into his geometry. She was a storm disguised as a woman, a riddle wrapped in buckskin. He lowered the rifle, just an inch, his eyes never leaving hers. "Talk," he growled, "but make it quick. The marshals aren't far behind me, and they don't have my patience." Clementine sat back down, the shadows stretching long across the floorboards. She began to tell a story of betrayal that reached all the way to the heart of the territory's capital. She spoke of a land grab masked as a railroad expansion, of silver mines that were being salted with the blood of innocent families, and of a ledger that contained the names of every man who had sold his soul for a piece of the frontier. The gold she was accused of stealing wasn't federal property. It was the life savings of the people of this land, being funneled into a private war chest for a man Jeb had once called a friend. As she spoke, Jeb felt the foundations of his world shifting. He had always prided himself on his neutrality, on his ability to remain detached from the morality of his marks. But Clementine's voice was like a needle stitching his conscience back together. She wasn't just a woman with a price on her head. She was a witness to a crime so vast it made his own sins look like child's play. The suspense in the room grew thick, a tangible thing that made the air feel heavy. Outside, the snow began to fall in earnest, a white shroud covering the tracks of the hunter and the hunted alike. Jeb moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. The mountain was silent, but it was a deceptive silence. He knew that out there, in the white dark, men with cold hearts and loaded guns were closing in. They didn't want Clementine for her crimes. They wanted her because she was the only thing standing between them and total control of the territory. "Why me?" Jeb asked, turning back to her. "Why tell me this? You could have shot me when I walked through that door. You had the chance." Clementine looked at the fire, her expression unreadable. "Because I saw your father's eyes in yours, Jeb. He was a good man who got caught in a bad machine. He wanted you to be better than he was. And I think, deep down, you're tired of being the man who hunts for money. I think you want to be the man who hunts for the truth." The words hit him like a physical blow. He wanted to laugh, to mock her for her sentimentality, but the laughter died in his throat. He looked at his hands, calloused, scarred, stained with the dust of 100 trails. He had spent so long looking for the worst in people that he had forgotten how to recognize the best. Suddenly, the charcoal stallion outside let out a sharp, panicked whinny. Jeb was across the room in a heartbeat, his rifle back in his hands. He blew out the candle, plunging the cabin into a darkness broken only by the dying embers of the hearth. "They're here," he whispered. The sound of hoofbeats muffled by the snow reached his ears, a rhythmic drumming that signaled the arrival of death. Clementine stood beside him, her own revolver now in her hand, the steel glinting in the dark. "There's a hidden path behind the cabin," she said, her voice steady despite the danger. "It leads down to the creek bed. If we move now, we can lose them in the trees." Jeb looked at her, his mind racing. He could still hand her over. He could still take the easy path, the profitable path. But as he looked at the woman who had seen his soul through a cloud of gunpowder, he knew there was no going back. He wasn't just a bounty hunter anymore. He was a protector. "Keep low," Jeb commanded, his voice regaining its authority. They slipped out the back door, the freezing air biting at their faces. The world was a blur of white and gray, the trees standing like sentinels in the gloom. Behind them, they heard the shouts of men and the splintering of wood as the front door of the cabin was kicked in once again. A torch flared to life, casting a hellish orange glow against the snow. Jeb saw the silhouettes of the riders, 6 of them, heavily armed, their long coats billowing in the wind. They weren't marshals. They were mercenaries, led by a man Jeb recognized from the war, Silas the Butcher Vance. Silas was a man who didn't take prisoners. He took trophies. Jeb felt a cold, familiar rage rising within him. Silas represented everything he had become, everything he was now trying to escape. They moved through the brush, the snow crunching under their feet with agonizing loudness. Every snap of a twig felt like a gunshot. Jeb led the way, his eyes scanning the terrain for any advantage. He knew these mountains better than most, but the blizzard was changing the landscape, turning familiar landmarks into alien shapes. Clementine followed close behind, her breathing rhythmic and controlled. She didn't complain about the cold or the pace. She moved with a grim determination that earned Jeb's silent respect. They reached the edge of the creek bed, the water a black ribbon cutting through the white. The ice was thin, cracking under the weight of their boots as they crossed. "We need to find cover," Jeb whispered, huddling against a granite outcropping. "They'll have trackers." Silas has a man with him who can smell a trail through 6 inches of fresh powder. "They'll find our prints as soon as the wind dies down." Clementine nodded, her face pale in the moonlight. "There's a cave 2 miles north. It's narrow, easy to defend. If we can make it there, we can wait out the storm and figure out our next move." Jeb looked back toward the cabin. The orange glow was fading, replaced by the relentless white of the blizzard. He knew they were being followed by more than just men. They were being followed by the weight of their choices. He looked at Clementine, the woman with a bounty on her head and a fire in her spirit, and he realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the destination. He only cared about the journey. The first part of their escape was a grueling climb against the wind. Jeb pushed Clementine forward, his hand on the small of her back, feeling the strength in her muscles. They were 2 broken pieces of a world that was trying to grind them into dust, but together they were something new, something dangerous. The curiosity of what she knew, the mystery of the gold, and the growing heat between them served as a fuel against the biting cold. Jebediah Stone, the man who hunted ghosts, had finally found something real to fight for. But as the shadows of Silas's men grew longer in the snow behind them, he wondered if they would live long enough to see the dawn. Every step was a battle. The snow reached their knees, dragging at their legs like the hands of the dead. Jeb kept his ears tuned to the wind, listening for the telltale sounds of pursuit. He heard a distant shout, a whistle, the neigh of a horse. They were close. Too close. He found a spot where the trees grew thick and the snow was sheltered by a dense canopy of pine. "Wait here," he signaled to Clementine. He doubled back, his boots treading carefully in his own tracks. He spent 10 minutes creating a false trail that led toward the edge of a steep ravine, then circled back to where she was waiting. It was an old trick, one he had used a dozen times to trap his prey. Now, he was using it to save his life. When he returned to Clementine, she was shivering, her teeth chattering like dice in a cup. He pulled off his heavy shearling coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, ignoring his own sudden chill. "I don't need your charity, Jeb," she hissed, though she pulled the coat tighter. "It's not charity," he replied, his eyes scanning the horizon. "It's an investment. I can't find out the truth from a frozen corpse." The lie felt familiar, but they both knew it was a lie. The bounty was dead. The hunter was gone. All that remained was a man and a woman in the dark, fighting for a tomorrow that wasn't promised to anyone. The suspense tightened like a noose as they reached the entrance to the cave. It was a jagged hole in the rock, hidden by a curtain of frozen ivy. Jeb ushered her inside, the air suddenly still and smelling of ancient stone. He didn't dare light a fire. They sat in the dark, huddled together for warmth, their hearts beating in a frantic, synchronized rhythm. "Why did you really come after me, Jeb?" Clementine whispered into the darkness, her breath warm against his neck. Jeb stared into the void, his mind drifting back to the first time he had seen her picture. "I told myself it was the money," he said softly. "But I think I was just looking for a reason to stop running. I thought if I caught you, I could finally go home. I just didn't realize that home wasn't a place. It was a feeling." The silence that followed was heavy with everything they hadn't said. In the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that echoed the emptiness of the frontier. They were safe for now, but the hunt had only just begun. The cowboy had fallen for the woman with a price on her head, and in the West, that was the most expensive mistake a man could ever make. Jeb closed his eyes, listening to Clementine's breathing, and for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of a different kind of debt. Not a debt of gold, but a debt of blood and honor. Silas Vance was still out there, and the butcher didn't like to lose his meat. Jeb gripped his rifle, knowing that when the sun rose, the snow would be stained red. The morning light was a cruel, gray blade cutting through the frozen ivy at the cave's entrance, signaling that the time for hiding had come to a violent end. Jeb Stone sat with his back against the weeping stone wall, his Henry repeater resting across his lap like a sleeping predator. Beside him, Clementine's breathing was shallow, her body tense even in sleep, a coiled spring of survival instinct. The darkness of the cave had been a brief sanctuary, but as the shadows receded, the reality of their situation set in with the weight of a hanging judge's gavel. Jeb looked at his hands, calloused and stained with the dust of 1,000 miles, and then at the woman who had upended his world in a single night. He had spent his life believing that every man had a price, but looking at Clementine, he realized that some things, like the truth about his father's death and the fire in her eyes, were beyond the reach of gold. The suspense of the silence outside was more deafening than the blizzard had been. It was the silence of a predator waiting for its prey to bolt. He knew Silas, the butcher, Vance was out there, circling like a vulture, waiting for the first sign of movement. Jeb stood up, his joints popping like dry kindling. He moved to the mouth of the cave, peering through the tangled vines. The world was a blinding, pristine white, a beautiful wasteland that offered no cover and no mercy. "We can't stay here," he whispered, his voice a low rasp. Clementine was awake instantly, her hand already gripping her revolver. She didn't ask if he was sure. She knew the rhythm of the hunt as well as he did. "They'll be at the base of the ridge," she said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Silas won't wait for the thaw. They'll want to finish this before the marshals get a whiff of the ledger." Jeb nodded. He knew Silas wasn't just after the bounty or the gold. Silas was after the legacy. If Clementine died, the secret of the Stone family's betrayal died with her. The emotional hook of their connection was now tied to a ticking clock. Every second they spent in the cave was a second Silas used to close the trap. Jeb checked his ammunition. 20 rounds left in the belt and a full tube in the Henry. It wasn't enough for an army, but it was enough for a reckoning. They stepped out into the biting cold, their boots sinking deep into the fresh powder. They moved with a desperate urgency, heading toward the Devil's Throat, a narrow canyon 3 miles to the east that was the only way off the mountain without being seen from the valley. The suspense was a living thing now, a phantom treading on their heels. Every snap of a frozen branch sounded like a pistol shot. Jeb led the way, his eyes scanning the tree-line for the telltale glint of a rifle scope. He felt a strange, new sensation in his chest. Not fear, but a protective rage. He had fallen for the woman with a price on her head, and for the first time in his life, he understood why men died for things they couldn't carry in a saddlebag. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. A high-velocity round hissed past Jeb's ear, thudding into a pine tree with a sickening crack. "Down!" he roared, lunging for Clementine and tackling her into the snow just as a second shot echoed through the canyon. They rolled behind a fallen log, the bark exploding in a shower of splinters above their heads. "It's him," Jeb hissed, his teeth bared. "Silas has a sharps. He's perched on the northern rim." The curiosity of how they had been tracked so precisely was replaced by the immediate need for survival. Silas was a master of the long game, a man who would pick them apart from a distance before moving in for the kill. The emotional anchor of the story was being tested in the crucible of lead and ice. Clementine looked at Jeb, her face pale, but her hands steady. "If we stay here, he'll just wait for us to freeze or run out of cover," she said. Jeb looked at the stretch of open ground between them and the entrance to the Devil's Throat. It was 100 yards of exposure. "I'll draw his fire," Jeb said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, final tone. "When I start shooting, you run for the canyon. Don't stop. Don't look back. You have the ledger, Clementine. You're the only one who can make them pay." Clementine grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "I'm not leaving you, Jeb Stone. You're the only thing I have left in this world that isn't a lie." The words hit him harder than Silas's bullets. The hook was set, They weren't just a hunter and his mark anymore. They were two broken pieces of the West, trying to find a way to fit together. Jeb didn't argue. He couldn't. He rose from behind the log, not with a crawl, but with a defiant roar, and emptied his Henry toward the northern rim. He wasn't aiming to kill. He was aiming to suppress, to blind Silas with the dust of his own hubris. In the chaos, they both bolted. They ran with a desperation that defied the deep snow, their lungs burning with the intake of sub-zero air. Bullets kicked up plumes of white around their feet, but the mountains seemed to offer them a momentary veil of fog. They reached the mouth of the canyon just as Silas's crew appeared on the ridge behind them. 6 riders, dark silhouettes against the gray sky, looking like the horsemen of the apocalypse. The Devil's Throat was a jagged scar in the earth, the walls rising hundreds of feet on either side, narrow enough in places that a man could touch both sides with his outstretched arms. The wind here was channeled into a constant morning howl. They pushed deep into the shadows, the light of the sun failing to reach the floor of the canyon. The suspense was suffocating. Every bend in the rock felt like an ambush. "He'll come for us," Clementine whispered, her breath hitching. Silas doesn't know how to let go. Jeb didn't answer. He was looking at the ground. He saw something that made his blood run colder than the blizzard. Not footprints, but old, rusted iron rings bolted into the rock. This wasn't just a canyon. It was an old mine entrance that had been abandoned decades ago. And the ledger Clementine carried, it wasn't just a list of names. It was a map to this very spot. The curiosity of the mystery began to take a dark turn. "Clementine," Jeb said, stopping dead in his tracks. "The gold your senator found, the gold that my father died for, it isn't in a vault in Cheyenne, is it?" Clementine stopped and turned to him, the shadows of the canyon deepening the lines on her face. She reached into her vest and pulled out the ledger, her fingers trembling. "The gold never existed, Jeb. That's the secret. The federal gold was a myth created by the governor and Silas to secure loans from the banks back east. They used the myth to buy the land, to build a railroad, to create an empire out of nothing but a lie and the blood of men like your father." Jeb felt a wave of nausea. His entire life, his father's death, his career as a bounty hunter, Silas's rise to power, was built on a vacuum. A ghost. The emotional hook of his redemption was suddenly tied to a vast, hollow conspiracy. They weren't running from the law. They were running from the guardians of a lie that had swallowed the West whole. The sound of horses entered the canyon behind them. The rhythmic drumming of hooves against the stone floor echoed and amplified, making it sound like 100 riders were descending upon them. "Silas!" Jeb shouted into the dark, his voice bouncing off the walls. "I know the truth. I know there is no gold. The game is over." A cold, mocking laughter responded, echoing from the throat of the canyon. "The game is never over, little brother." Silas's voice was amplified by the stone, sounding like the mountain itself was speaking. "The truth is just another commodity, and I'm the only one who knows how to trade it. Give me the woman and the ledger, and I'll let you die with your dignity. Resist, and I'll make sure you're remembered as the man who murdered the senator and stole the people's future." The suspense reached a breaking point. Jeb looked at Clementine, and for the first time, he saw not just a partner, but a mirror of his own soul. They were trapped in the Devil's Throat with a butcher at their back and a lie ahead of them. "We have to fight," Clementine said, her voice turning into steel. "If we die making sure that lie burns with us." Jeb felt a surge of pride. He took her hand, his rough palm against hers, and for a fleeting moment, the violence of the frontier faded away. "I'm with you, Clementine," to the end of the trail. They moved deeper into the canyon, finding a narrow crevice where the rock had collapsed, creating a natural fortress. Jeb set his rifle on the ledge, his eyes fixed on the bend in the canyon where the light of the torches was beginning to flicker against the walls. The first rider rounded the corner, a torch in one hand and a revolver in the other. Jeb didn't hesitate. He fired, the report of the Henry deafening in the confined space. The rider tumbled from his horse, the torch falling into the snow and hissing out. Then came the others. A hail of lead erupted in the canyon, the bullets ricocheting off the stone walls like angry hornets. Jeb and Clementine fought side by side, a symphony of fire and grit. The emotional intensity of the battle was visceral. Every shot fired was a rejection of the world that had tried to break them. But the numbers were against them. One of the mercenaries managed to get a high angle, his bullet grazing Jeb's shoulder, spinning him around. "Yep," Clementine cried, moving to help him, but he pushed her back. "Keep firing," he roared. Suddenly, Silas appeared. He wasn't on a horse. He was standing on a ledge 20 feet above them, his sharp's rifle leveled at Clementine's head. He looked like a demon in the flickering light of the remaining torches. "It ends here," Silas screamed. "The Stone family name dies today." He pulled the trigger, but in that split second, Jeb lunged across the crevice, his body a shield. The heavy buffalo slug hit Jeb in the side, the force of the impact throwing him backward against the rock. Clementine screamed, a sound of pure agony that tore through the canyon. As she fired her revolver upward, the bullets striking the rock around Silas, forcing him to duck. The suspense of the final act was now painted in Jeb's blood. He lay on the cold stone, his vision swimming, his hand clutching the side of his coat where the red was spreading fast. Clementine was over him in an instant, her tears falling onto his face. "No, no, Jeb, stay with me," she sobbed. Jeb looked at her, a bloody smile on his lips. "The ledger." He coughed. "Burn it, Clementine. If the gold is a lie, then the lie has to die with Silas." But then a realization hit him, a final provocative hook that changed everything. He looked at the rock wall behind him, where the bullet from Silas's rifle had chipped away the stone. It wasn't just red granite. Underneath the surface, glinting in the torchlight, was a vein of yellow. Real raw gold. Jeb's eyes widened. The lie. The lie wasn't that there was no gold. The lie was that the gold was gone. Silas and the governor hadn't used a myth to build their empire. They'd found the richest vein in the history of the West and had been keeping it for themselves, murdering anyone who got close. My father didn't die for a lie, Jeb realized. He died because he found the truth. The curiosity of the entire journey was subverted in an instant. The gold was right there under their feet, the very thing that had turned Silas into a monster. Jeb grabbed Clementine's hand, his grip tightening. "The mountain," he whispered. "It's all gold. That's why he won't let us leave." The sound of Silas descending the rocks reached them. He was coming to finish it. Jeb looked at the ledge above them, where a series of old mining timbers held up a massive overhang of loose shale. It was a dead man's switch. "Clementine," Jeb said, his voice steadying with a final, desperate purpose. "When he gets close, shoot the timbers." She looked at him, horror in her eyes, as she realized what he was asking. "I won't leave you, Jeb." "You won't," he said, pulling her close for a final, brief kiss that tasted of salt and gunpowder. "But Silas is coming to claim his prize. Let's make sure it's the last thing he ever claims." The emotional stakes had reached their zenith. Silas stepped into the crevice, his face a mask of greed and triumph. He saw Jeb bleeding on the ground and Clementine holding the ledger. He didn't see the vein in the wall. He didn't see the timbers. Finally, Silas breathed, his rifle aimed at Jeb's heart. "The gold is mine." Clementine looked at Jeb one last time, and in his eyes, she saw the man he had become, the man who had stopped the hunt. She turned her revolver not at Silas, but at the rotted cedar timbers holding up the roof of the canyon. "It's not yours, Silas," she said, her voice cold as the mountain wind. "It belongs to the earth." She pulled the trigger. The explosion of falling rock was a roar that swallowed the world. The canyon walls groaned and collapsed, a deluge of stone and ancient gold burying everything in its path. Silas's scream was cut short as the mountain claimed its butcher. The suspense of the story ended in a thunderous finality, a tomb of wealth and violence sealed forever. But as the dust settled and the silence returned to the devil's throat, something moved in the wreckage. A hand, reaching through the debris, clutching a silver locket. The cowboy had fallen for the woman with a price on her head, and the West had exacted its toll. But as the sun finally broke over the rim of the canyon, it didn't shine on gold. It shone on a trail of blood leading out of the darkness, toward a horizon where the price of a soul was finally paid in full. The dust of the collapse hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating shroud, turning the morning light into a sickly amber haze. Silence, absolute and terrifying, had reclaimed the devil's throat. Under the weight of 1,000 tons of stone and the cursed gold of the Stone family, the butcher had been silenced. But the story of Jebediah Stone and Clementine Louvet was not buried beneath the rubble. It was bleeding into the snow. Jeb lay gasping, his lungs filled with the grit of pulverized rock and the metallic tang of his own impending death. The impact of the landslide had thrown him clear of the main collapse, but he was pinned beneath a cedar timber, his legs crushed and his strength fading into the numbing cold. He looked up and saw Clementine. She was alive, standing amidst the ruins like a ghost of the frontier, her cloak tattered and her face streaked with soot. She wasn't running. She wasn't searching for the ledger. She was looking at Jeb with an expression that made the wound in his side feel like a minor sting. It was a look of pure, unadulterated calculation. The emotional hook that had sustained Jeb through the blizzard, the belief that he was the protector a woman wronged, began to fray at the edges. Clementine walked toward him, her footsteps light on the shifting stones. She didn't kneel to help him. She didn't reach for his hand. She simply stood over him, the silver locket he had given her swinging rhythmically like a pendulum. "You did well, Jebediah," she said, her voice no longer a melodic rasp, but a cold, precise instrument. "My father was right about you. You have the stone grit. You just didn't have the stone vision." Jeb felt a surge of confusion, a spike of curiosity that burned through his exhaustion. What? What are you talking about, Clementine? Silas is dead. The gold is buried. It's over." Clementine smiled, and for the first time, Jeb saw the true predator. It wasn't Silas. It wasn't the governor. It was the woman who had led him by the heart through the gates of hell. Silas was a blunt instrument, Jeb. He wanted the gold to buy power. I want the power to render the gold irrelevant. She reached in her vest and pulled out the ledger, the one Jeb thought he had told her to burn. She flipped it open, showing him the pages. They weren't lists of names or bank accounts. They were geological surveys signed by Jeb's father, dated years before the federal gold myth even began. Your father didn't discover this vein, Jeb. He invented the myth of its disappearance to protect it until I was old enough to claim it. He wasn't murdered by Silas. He was murdered by me because he started to have second thoughts. He started to look at you and see his son instead of a soldier for our cause. The suspense shifted from a physical threat to a psychological nightmare. Jeb stared at her, his mind reeling as the pieces of the puzzle rearranged themselves into a hideous new picture. Every accidental encounter, every provocative hook, every moment of shared vulnerability in the cave. It had all been a script written by a woman who knew exactly how to play a man who was looking for redemption. She hadn't fallen for the cowboy. She had utilized him as a shield to remove the only obstacle between her and the mountain, Silas. Now, with the butcher buried and Jeb pinned, she was the sole heir to the truth. What? Jeb wheezed, the blood pooling in his throat. Why the bounty? Why the chase? Because a woman moving through the West with this much knowledge is a target, she whispered, leaning down so her face was inches from his. But a woman being hunted by the legendary Jebediah Stone is a tragedy. I needed the world to see you save me, Jeb. I needed the marshals to find your body here, the hero who died stopping his villainous brother. It makes my story undeniable. It makes my claim to this land absolute. You aren't a bounty hunter anymore, Jeb. You're the final sacrifice in the Stone family legacy. She reached down and unclipped the silver locket from her neck, dropping it onto his chest. Keep it. It looks better on a martyr. The curiosity of the audience would be at its peak now. The ultimate betrayal in a world built on trust and lead. Jeb felt the coldness of the locket against his skin, a mocking reminder of the love he thought he had found. He tried to reach for his Colt, but his arm was a lead weight. He was watching the sun rise over a world he no longer understood. Clementine turned away, heading toward the charcoal stallion that stood waiting at the canyon's exit. She moved with the grace of a woman who had already forgotten the man she was leaving behind. But as she reached the horse, a shadow moved in the tree line. A lone rider, wearing a clean duster and a star that caught the light. "Stay right there, Miss Louvain," a voice boomed. It wasn't a mercenary. It was a U.S. Marshal, backed by a dozen men who had been silent observers of the final act. Jeb felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by the Marshal's next words. "We've been tracking the Stone family for 10 years. We knew your father's plan. We knew Silas's greed. And we knew your ambition, Clementine." The Marshal rode forward, his eyes looking past her to the broken man beneath the timber. "And we knew Jebediah would be the one to lead us to the source." The final, surprising twist was a double-edged sword. Jeb hadn't been the protector. He had been the bait for the law, just as he had been the tool for Clementine. The entire God of the West epic was a trap set by an even larger machine. The Marshal looked at the vein of gold glinting in the rock, and then at the carnage of the canyon. "The gold belongs to the government now. And as for you, Jebediah, you did your country a service. But you're still a bounty hunter with a trail of bodies behind you. We can't have heroes with blood on their hands." Clementine laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound. "So no one wins? Is that it? The mountain stays with the law?" The Marshal shook his head. "No, Miss Louvain, the mountain stays with the silence." He signaled to his men, who began setting charges of their own along the rim of the canyon. They weren't here to arrest anyone. They were here to erase the secret entirely. The West wasn't ready for this much truth, and the government wasn't ready for this much gold to hit the market. They were going to bury the devil's throat forever, with Jeb and Clementine inside it. The suspense of the final seconds was a frantic, desperate scramble. Clementine tried to bolt, but a rifle shot rang out, dropping her horse. She fell into the snow, reaching for her pistol, but the Marshals were faster. Lead shredded the air, and she collapsed just feet from the entrance. Jeb watched it all with a strange sense of peace. He looked at the sky, the blue so deep it felt like he could fall into it. He had fallen for the woman who killed his father, and he had been betrayed by the country he served. But in the final moments, he saw the truth. The West didn't belong to the hunters, the prey, or the law. It belonged to the dust. The charges detonated. The rim of the canyon gave way in a final, majestic roar of stone and earth. The light was extinguished as the ceiling of the world came down to meet the floor. Jebediah Stone closed his eyes, the image of the silver locket the last thing burned into his mind. That the cowboy fell in love with the woman who had a bounty on her head was a story of a price paid in full. The gold, the lies, the betrayal. It was all sealed in a tomb of red granite. When the Marshals rode away, the wind was the only thing left to howl through the medicine-bound mountains. They left no markers. They left no graves. Years later, legends would persist of a hidden canyon filled with gold and the ghosts of two brothers and a woman who tried to outrun the sun. But no one would ever find it. The God of the West had claimed his own. The final hook for the viewers, a wide shot of the mountain, silent and indifferent as the snow began to fall again, erasing the last of the tracks, leaving only the legend of the man who hunted a heart and found a grave. The screen fades to black, the sound of a single, distant spur's clink echoing before the silence of the credits.